In this video we're going to sort this mess out, and I'm going to tell you which top 5 metallic paints I actually use regularly and why. So sorry about the overly dramatic video start there, but I've just counted how many metallic paints I've got after 3 years of painting, and there's 19 here. Bearing in mind, you know, the main metallic thing I paint is armour. Why I've accumulated 19 metallic paints, I don't know. Well, I do know, it's because I'm a paint nut. But yeah, I mean, my theory going that it's better to be addicted to collecting paint than it is collecting unpainted miniatures. But yeah, I mean, metallic paint is you could do 10 different videos about this subject. But I wanted to sort of tell people what I tend to use the most, bearing in mind how much armour I paint, because I'm a bit of a Wars of the Roses fiend. And I've tried all sorts of different types, as you can see, over the last 3 years. And I've sort of realised I've settled on 4 or 5 that I actually use a lot, because there's a lot of different brands represented here. There's a lot of different tones and types of metal here in front of you as well. So I'll go through which 5 I've actually ended up using a lot. By the way, I have given away a handful of metallic paints that aren't here as well, so in actuality I've probably had more than 20 metallic paints since I started 3 years ago. But we'll sort of go in a kind of rundown sort of order. I'll explain why I use each one. So, you know, the one I use the least out of the 5 I'll do first, all the way up to the one that is my favourite and is my sort of I suppose the one I've definitely used the most recently, and explain why. And yeah, then I'll go through a bit about the brands as well. But I mean, just to cover off the basics of metallic paint, if you're watching this as a complete beginner, metallic paint is not as an easy a subject as it first appears, I suppose, because you realise that they behave just as differently depending on brand and tone and stuff as any other miniature paint does. And also you can apply all sorts of stuff and mix them in with stuff and get all kinds of effects with them. So it's not immediately obvious what does well for what job. And like all paint brands, really, all paints, you know, companies bring out a multitude of variations, and you'll often see the same kind of paint replicated across different brands. And I suppose it can be quite confusing if you don't really know what you're looking for. And then also, if you're brand new to this, by the way, you know, metallic paint is not that easy to work with compared to some other paints, so it tends to be very tacky and thick. It's got, in most cases, it's got tiny bits of metal in it, which is what creates that shininess. There's genuine metal fragments, tiny fragments of metal inside the paint, which is another reason it absolutely destroys your brush. And then its thickness can make it tricky at times. So there's good reason to pay more attention to metallics than you would initially think there is. But let's get into our 5 then. And the sort of number 5 on the list out of this little crowd in front of us, that I use less frequently now, but I've definitely got into it a lot over the last 3 years, is an older paint called Chainmail, which is a Citadel colour paint, which somebody tell me down in the comments whether they actually make this exact name anymore, because it's a Games Workshop paint, which means that Games Workshop being Games Workshop, they tend to sort of update and change their paint ranges an awful lot, and I'm pretty sure that it does whatever the equivalent of it is these days, doesn't look like this anymore. But I bought this from somebody else a few years ago, so it's even older than how long I've owned it. But it's a great paint because it's consistent. It does exactly what it says in the tin. So if you've undercoated something very dark and mucky, perhaps with another metal paint, and you want to create a chainmail effect on a chainmail figure, you can dry brush a little bit of this on the chainmail and it creates a lovely little chainmail sort of sheen, because chainmail is quite hard to replicate. The colour of it, if you look at real chainmail in real life, it's not just dark silver, it's all sorts of different colours, and the way it catches the light because of its texture is quite unique. And this is, you know, as close as damned you can get to how the light catches the edge of chainmail. I wouldn't paint something in, I wouldn't block in something in this, no way, because it's too shiny. But it's great as a sort of top coat kind of thing, or a highlight or a dry brush highlight, and it's very reliable. So that's number 5. Put him over there. Number 4 is, we could go down a rabbit hole here, but I won't. I'll keep it short and sweet. But number 4 is a colour from Scale Colour, also known as Scale 75, which are a miniature paint brand that you probably won't immediately come across as a new person if you're new to this. It's this paint range is used a lot by sort of fantasy painters. It's used a lot by, I suppose you'd describe them as high-end Games Workshop painters. People painting busts and specialist miniatures use these a lot, and indeed they do their own miniatures that are geared around their paints. Doesn't mean that you can't use them if you're relatively new, don't think that. They're a really good range, and they do a very specialist metallics set. And one of them is called Black Metal, which is exactly what it does in the tin. It's a black paint, and I'll stick a picture up of a miniature that's got a bit of this on it, because black metal is cool. So, you know, if you want to create a bit of variation with your knights or men at arms, or create a bit of character, blackening down the armour and creating a bit of sort of mystique or a high prestige character using black metal armour is a great way of doing it. But few people use a specialist black metal paint, or produce a specialist black metal paint, I should say. So in many cases you have to kind of mix paints around, but here they've actually created something in the set that is geared towards a black metal look, and it's good. You know, there are other ways to create black metal looks. You don't have to buy this. Simple ways that I'll probably cover in a different video another time. But this is pretty damn good for a quick effort if you're doing a black metal miniature. So that's number 4. Number 3, again, you know, this is a colour which we could spend a lot of time on, but it's actually a gold colour. Gold does come up a lot in my miniatures because of when you're painting characters and leaders in Wars of Roses and Medieval, you get a lot of sort of fancy tinsely bits on their armour, because you know the medieval period is all about status and showing off your power and status with how you look and what you're wearing. So gold or sort of gold tinted armour was common in the much higher ranks. So your rich earls and kings and stuff would have bits of gold on their gear. But gold is a tricky colour, it seems, for miniature paint companies. They don't tend to do particularly good jobs, I think, in general. You get some really odd looking colours that are branded as gold that you just think, that's not like a gold I've ever seen. But this is something called old gold. It's a Vallejo paint. And you know, anybody who's been around for a while will know who Vallejo are, but if you're new, Vallejo are a very popular miniature paint brand range. They've got a huge range. They're very easily available generally, from places like the internet, and even in hobby stores in the UK. You can just pick them off shelves. They're a really good range, and they do this very clever old gold, because gold rarely looks that kind of cartoon Treasure Island sort of gold colour. They've cottoned on to the fact that that particularly if it's something that's worn a lot or is worn in battle or is a bit old and been passed down and beaten, it looks a little bit more like that. It's a bit more greeny, it's a bit more, you know, where the, I don't know, the chemical reactions have started and things have started to wear down in the metal. And they've tried to reproduce that, they've done a pretty good job of it, and again I'll get some pictures up of where I've used this. It's really good for things like sword hilts and things, and pommels of higher status figures weaponry, because, you know, if you've ever held, been lucky enough like I have to hold a sword from that period, granted with the passage of time it's changed its colour an awful lot, but when you actually look at the pommel of a sword that's got gold on it, or a gold colour to it, or a metal that's trying to imitate gold, it does have a certain sort of look to it, and this is quite close to what I've seen on real life weaponry or real life stuff from that time. That's another story, how I got to handle stuff that was gold that was made in the 15th century. That's for another video. But I have, and I can tell you that it doesn't look like an engagement ring, it looks more like this. So yeah, old gold is a good one for your gold. And by the way, you would paint up from this. So say you had a piece of armour, I don't know, a cuirass or whatever, that you wanted to paint. I just want to paint that one bit gold. You would probably start with this, and then you might wash on it a little bit, and then you would maybe go up with lighter golds. But a general gold base is a hard thing to find, and they've more or less cracked it with that one. Well done, Vallejo. So that was number 3. Number 2 is another Vallejo. That's the wrong one. Is another Vallejo. It's from their game colour range, which is more towards the fantasy or kind of painter, I guess, for Vallejo painters, Vallejo paint fans. It's called silver. Simple as that. It's very bright. It's extremely bright. It's kind of like a white silver. And it's just best described as a highlight paint. That's how I use it anyway. And I'll put some pictures up, but I use it on the very tiniest tints and bits, like the very tiniest points of the corner of a helmet, the point of a sword, something that will just catch the light in tiny bits. It's best used sparingly because it's very bright, very. You would not block anything in with this, no way. Not unless you were trying to create something that looked like a mirror, basically. But this is perfect for that. And there's lots of people who've tried to do something, but they tend to be very watery, or other brands that have tried this, they tend to be too bright or too white, and they're quite inconsistent when you get the effect. When you, for some reason, I find anyway personally, when you're trying to create a metallic colour that's extremely bright, it seems to be harder to create consistency with the paint, so you have to mix a lot, or you have to shake up a lot to get it to be consistent. But this is very solid. So yeah, that's number 2. Which brings us to number 1. I can't say that I discovered this entirely independently, but it is an absolute ninja. It came from watching a video by a guy called Vince Venturella, who I've mentioned once, twice before, I think. But he's a painter. He's got a great YouTube channel by the same name. I'll put a link below. He paints a lot of fantasy and Warhammer to an incredibly high standard. We're talking multinational award-winning standard. He's got a great channel and his stuff's amazing. But he talks a lot about a series of paints that, again, Vallejo do. But he often mentions one in particular for if you're trying to create steel and armour, and it's this. It's very shiny. I apologise for that. It's hard to read. But it's quite a big fat bottle. And it's from the Vallejo Acrylic Metal Colour Airbrush Colours range. And it's called Steel. Notice it says Airbrush Colours. But wait, you say, I don't have an airbrush. I don't use an airbrush. No intention of using an airbrush. Maybe you do have an airbrush. But if you don't, it doesn't matter. Just because it says airbrush doesn't mean you only have to use it in an airbrush. I've only ever used it with a brush. And this stuff is like magic. Why is it so good? By the way, the fact it's such a big fat bottle, I suppose, is because it's designed for airbrush. Why is it so magic? Why? All of these other paints, I find, it's quite hard to move them around and get them on because of their consistency. So they tend to be thicker, so of course you can thin them down a bit and stuff, but then they seem to sort of lose a lot of their sort of, I don't know, traction, if that's the right word. But there's something about this that it goes on to a miniature more consistently and smoothly than any other paint I've ever worked with. It's like colouring in with a felt tip pen. It's that good, which is great for a metal paint. Also, when you do things to it, like you, I don't know, add a bit of black in there to bring it down a bit, you get some great looking, just by putting in like a matte black, 50-50, you'll get a really cool black metal colour with this. So it works well with other paints. It does really well when you get a wash over it to dull it down and mucky it up a bit. You can add blue to it, to like a touch of blue to play around with the feel of steel in the colour, and it works well. And unbelievably, it just seems to sort of, is self-leveling the right technical word? But when you put this on and move it around the surface of miniature, which I'll do in a bit, and show you how this works, it just seems to sort of settle itself, and you don't get any horrible tacky, sticky, thick bits on the miniature. It just seems to settle in really nicely. And I'll paint something up in a bit using this, and you'll see the results of how it goes on. I'll show you quickly how it works. But it's pretty magic. It's a little bit more expensive than buying just one of these, because it's bigger and it's an airbrush paint, so hey, it's technical, but it isn't, you know. It's 32ml bottle, so I'm never going to run out of this. It's going to take a long time. It's well worth the investment. I've used it probably hundreds of times, and I will use it hundreds of times again. It's excellent. So without further ado, I'll shut up and let's see this in action and create something with this. So I'm recording this after I've painted this guy, but this is a Steel Fist Miniatures late 15th century knight, something I got recently. Really nice model. Been looking forward to painting for it for a while. And all I'm doing here is I've got my brown undercoat done, which is just a sort of chocolatey brown undercoat I put on most things these days. And then I'm getting that Vallejo metal colour steel and just going over the whole thing in a nice even coat. As you can see, it just kind of flies on. I've only sort of charged the brush once, and I can cover the whole, well, half of the miniature with one sort of brush full of paint. It goes on really evenly. So the next thing I do is I get some Agrax Earthshade, which is a Citadel / Games Workshop wash basically, and go all over that, the whole thing, every bit of metal you've got. And what that does is, even with this very sort of controlled metallic colour, it can look a little too even, a little too clean, a little too shiny, and just giving it an even, careful coat of Agrax, being careful not to pool it too much and spread it evenly along the cracks. It just brings it down that sort of extremely sort of shiny and even bits to it. So you don't want it to be too even, too shiny, if you want it to look sort of battle hardened and well worn. Also, this does bring back out some of those lovely details in a sculpt that's as good as this. So once you put that coat of paint on, you can take some of the depth away, and this just brings it back a bit. After that's dry, it's a cheeky dry brush, back on with exactly the same Vallejo steel metal colour paint. So all I'm doing here is I'm bringing back some of the sort of the sheen which the Agrax took away. So we've brought it back down and made it more realistic with the shade. But when you do that, it also can dull it too much. So if you bring it back up with a dry brush, you'll see what I mean. It just brings up that top layer of sort of 3D-ness, if that's a word, back. Try it, trust me, it sounds mad. Why would you paint something, then then wash it all over, and then dry brush it with the same thing? You know, to people who have not tried something like this before, it can sound a little mental, but it works. So once I've buffed it up again, you kind of buff it with your dry brush, then I'm doing some little picking out the straps with just a dark red brown. And there he is. I'll put a decent picture up for you. But basically, just wanted to show you how I use one or two of my favourite metal paints. When you get this out, ignore the fact it says airbrush. Use a brush with it. Get some washes and highlights involved. A bit of dry brushing. That's what you end up with. And it's one of the most effective, quick and believable metals that I've found. I think it's great, particularly for armour, if you know how to use it well. So yeah, he's not finished, obviously I'm going to base him up properly. But just wanted to quickly show you how fast and easy and effective that is with what is my favourite metallic miniature paint out of those 5 I showed you. I hope you found that useful. Do you do something similar? Have you tried this? Is there something that I'm missing? There will be. I'd love to know how people work with some of the other Citadel metal paints in particular, and there's loads of Vallejo metals which people will have tried. And if you try sort of coloured armour, let me know down in the comments. I'd be fascinated to know what people are using to get some effects. As always, like and subscribe if you've not already done so. Click the bell and then you'll get updates of all the videos I'm doing. Thanks so much for your support so far, and I'll see you again for another video next time. Bye for now.